Another thing I wanted to talk about in relation to the word feelings, as it appears in Gendlin, particularly in his use of the term felt sense to indicate some kind of awareness of the embodied circumstances that are accompanying any particular situation or thought. But why feelings? Why felt? And what's the particular significance of that, as opposed to what Gendlin refers to as the symbolic or the explicit, and which elsewhere I've referred to as kind of drawing on visual metaphors of objects. What's the significant difference? If there is a significant difference. Well, one of the things I've talked about is that the felt sense in Gendlin is very much experienced as interior. And in fact the whole concept of feelings, full stop, and the clue is in the word, suggests interiority, close proximity, contact. In order to feel something, you have to be in contact with it, you have to be pressed up against it, or it has to be kind of interior to you, so it's starting to mobilize your proprioceptive sense. It requires that kind of muscular engagement or visceral engagement. Symbolic knowledge, or symbolic ideas, or explicit ideas, don't necessarily involve that, or they don't point us towards that as a consideration. I think they point us more towards a kind of visual appreciation, a visual apprehension of that idea. So this, I was going to give an example of a tree, but it doesn't really work. So there's a sense in which that becoming symbolic, that making explicit, is a taking of the internal conditions, the felt sense, and a kind of spewing out into an object, maybe, or vice versa, or some kind of relationship between those interior, exterior, internally felt and visceral experiences, externally observed and detached experiences. Several things from that. Firstly, from Gendlin and other writers actually, but Gendlin in this case, his idea of the symbolic and the external is that it's largely composed of the felt. So although these experiences which seem to lie outside of ourselves, and he's talking about conceptual experiences rather than simple perceptions, but certain ideas can be thought of as lying outside of ourselves, and the more concrete and the more explicit we make them, the more they lie outside of ourselves. Nevertheless, they are completely composed and constituted of products of the felt sense. So in that regard, their origins are internal. And here I'm kind of reminded, or there's an echo here of Polanyi's tacit and explicit dimensions, which I think I mentioned before, in which the tacit is kind of outside or peripheral to focal awareness that we're constituting by mobilizing this tacit. In Gendlin, we mobilize or constitute the symbolic or the explicit by mobilizing, perceiving, and I would suggest externalizing the felt. So what's the significance of that? Well, I think there's several significances to that, really, and why the felt is most important. Because one of the things I find interesting about all that is that the felt sense is most clearly observable, I think, when under very certain circumstances. In circumstances like, for example, remembering something or recognizing something. So you kind of know if you have one of those tip of the tongue experiences where you're trying to remember a person's name and you're not quite sure what their name is. Their name is a kind of a piece of explicit information. It's out there in the world. it's kind of attached to them, if you like. And we kind of experience a person's name as being explicit. We can write it down and say it and all those kind of things. But when we're not quite sure what their name is, or we can't pull it to mind, we experience it as the tip of the tongue sensation, which is deeply, deeply felt. And when we hear what their name is, and we are reminded of it, the kind of certainty which floods in, that recognition, oh yes, of course, we say, that's felt. It's not externally demonstrated. It's felt as an experience of certainty, an experience of coherence, kind of, in which it's a deeply internal process, I think, or feels like a deeply internal process, and carries a lot of conviction with it as well, actually, because I think, I'm not sure if Gendlin talks about this or not, but certainly that kind of felt sense, when it's mobilized in the way that I've just suggested, in recognizing, for example, the name of someone whose name you couldn't remember a moment ago, but potentially also in things like beliefs, they carry enormous amounts of conviction, far more conviction, I would suggest, than symbolic and explicit information, or information which we regard primarily, which we see as detached from ourselves and refuse to acknowledge the felt components of. So, if someone told me their name, and I'd never met that person before, and they showed me their birth certificate, and they showed me their driving license, and they showed me their passport, all of this external evidence would certainly be more or less convincing. It would be very evidential, but I don't think I would still have that same sense of conviction, that same sense of certainty that I would have following that moment of remembering a person's name. It would be the external evidence of passports and birth certificates kind of stays out there, it stays detached and stays explicit, whereas recognition and remembering completely immobilizes the felt sense. And there's a conviction of the felt sense. Why is there a conviction of the felt sense? Well, that's a good question. I think, and I'm really clutching at straws with this one, is that there might be an origin there to do with salience and relevance. I mean, certainly one of the things I've thought about before is that the really, really important stuff, from a purely survival and adaptive point of view, the really important stuff is the stuff that's close to us, or pressing against our skin, or internal to us. We should, for very good reasons, throughout the hundreds of thousands and millions of years of our evolutionary histories, we are a species, and have been different species, that have survived because they've paid very close attention to what's happening close up, and have relegated lesser importance to things that are happening at a distance. Things that are happening at a distance are visible, but they're not tactile, you can't touch them. Things that are happening close up, you can touch, you can feel it against the skin, and things that are happening internally to oneself kind of become oneself, so they're really important. So we pay close attention to slaps and kisses, and food coming into our bodies, and different substances coming out of our bodies, and all the pleasures and pains that those can give. Distant sights on the horizon might be nice, but food is the first thing morals follow on as breakfast, I think. So I think that's a kind of evolutionary logic, and I realise I'm probably making a really Procrustean nightmare of this. There seems to be a kind of evolutionary logic for why the felt sense should give us a sense of conviction over any other kind of symbolic or explicit sense. Given the choice, we should believe our feelings, literal feelings as well as metaphorical feelings. We should believe those before we believe the evidence of our eyes. And I think we usually do, actually. I see it, but I don't believe it.